Well, our next speaker has his fingerprints all over U.S. trade policy and global trade policy. Jim Bacas is currently chair of Greenberg Traurig's global practice, and he's a leader in the firm's overall worldwide practice. His emphasis is on international business, including trade, investment, finance, and sustainable growth. Jim offers legal and strategic advice to worldwide clients based on his unique experience with the many issues relating to the global rules for trade and commerce of the World Trade Organization. I think Jim's clients are getting a valuable perspective because for 8 years, Jim served as chairman of the appellate body of the WTO. That's the final court of appeal, the sort of the Supreme Court of global trade rules in Geneva. The 7 judges of the appellate body hear final appeals in international trade disputes, which involve 95% of world commerce conducted by more than 5 billion people in the 160 countries and other customs territories that are members of the WTO. Jim was a founding member of this of the appellate body, was twice appointed by consensus to the WTO, consensus of the members of the WTO, twice elected chairman by his colleagues, and during his 8 years and 2 terms of service, he was the only American and the only North American on the appellate body. Jim was the only member of the appellate body who served on the tribunal during all of the 60 appeals it had and it heard in its first 8 years of the new WTO. Interestingly, his final decision for the WTO was on the U.S. Steel case from the early 2000s, a case brought against the United States by Europe and Japan and China, Brazil, and others, which found that the U.S. safeguards were violating its WTO commitments. But following the decision, the New York Times concluded that this case was the rough equivalent of Marbury versus Madison, which is the 1803 decision that established the Supreme Court as the final arbiter of the Constitution, able to force Congress and the executive branch to comply with its rulings. According to The American Lawyer, which wrote around that same time, James Bacas, as much as anyone, can lay claim to being the John Marshall of the World Trade Organization. In addition to his service at the WTO, Jim Bacas has also been a member of Congress. He served from 1991 to 1995, representing the 15th District of Florida. While in Congress, Jim was a leader in bipartisan efforts to advance international trade issues. He was a supporter of Presidential Fast Track Negotiating Authority, how topical, a leading supporter of the NAFTA, a vocal advocate of extending most favored nation treatment for China, a champion of the Caribbean Basin Initiative, and one of 6 original co-sponsors of the implementing legislation for the Uruguay Round trade agreements that created the WTO. From 1974 to 1976, Jim served as a senior aide to Florida Governor Reuben Askew, and from 79 to 1981, he served as a special assistant while Askew was U.S. Trade Representative in the Executive Office of the President during the Carter administration. Jim is also the author of a book called Trade and Freedom, which was published in London in 2004 by Cameron May. I've read it. It's an excellent book. It's really, for a technical book, it has a lot of really interesting prose. So it's the kind of thing you can read on the beach, actually. He writes and speaks frequently on a wide range of economic and other international issues in publications and on platforms worldwide. We are especially lucky to have him here today. Please help me welcome Jim Bacas.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you all. It's good to be back at Cato. I admire so much of all that's done here, and especially Cato's independent point of view, which is much needed in this city and this country. Like Scott, I want to hasten to say that I'm here today in my personal capacity, and none of the 1,700 other lawyers with Greenberg Traurig are in any way to blame for what I'm about to say. I don't really want to repeat anything that's been said. Mark and Scott have given us an exhaustive overview of the economics and the policy aspects and implications of this issue. I'll simply say that I am a free trader, and I believe that as a general rule, we should engage in free trade in energy. And that's my policy view. But I'm not here today to offer a policy view. I think I'm here today because of my experience in dealing with international law as it relates to trade. And it's perhaps because my approach is a bit different from that of some others you might hear in Washington. So often in Washington, the question of our international treaty obligations is an afterthought, if indeed it's a thought at all. Whereas for me, given the nearly decade I spent trying to plumb the depths of the covered agreements of the WTO Treaty, I tend to see all measures adopted and applied by the United States and all other WTO members through the prism of their WTO obligations. And that, I think, is why I'm here today. Given the time available, I'll be suggestive, not definitive. There will be no footnotes. If you want more detail later, let me know. Those 1,700 other lawyers at Greenberg Traurig would certainly want me to say that. But let me begin by trying to place some of this in context, following on a bit of what has already been said about our WTO obligations. First of all, it's important to understand, yes, we do have obligations under the WTO Treaty. We have embraced them. We have signed the agreement. We're bound by them. We remain a sovereign country. We can do as we choose, but if we don't comply with these treaty obligations, we stand to lose some of the benefits, potentially, of being a part of the WTO. And it can be very, very expensive if we don't comply with rulings against us in WTO dispute settlement. In the steel safeguard case, the United States of America did not comply because I was persuasive in my judgment, although I hope that we were. They complied because the United States stood to lose several $billion annually in previously granted concessions in other areas of trade if the United States did not comply. This is the source of both the strength and the controversy of WTO dispute settlement, because it is enforceable, because it is in the nature of hard law. Well, it just can't be ignored. So we're at risk if we ignore it. We can pass whatever laws we choose, we can have whatever policies we wish, but we may be called to court in Geneva to answer for them. My next point of context would be to note that an increasing concern of all members of the WTO, including especially the United States of America, has been the proliferation of export restrictions worldwide. A WTO report recently noted that more than 1/3 of all WTO members have imposed restrictions on exports recently, many times in food and agricultural areas, but increasingly with respect to other commodities. Historically, over the past half a century or so, WTO disputes have largely been about restrictions on imports. But increasingly, they are about restrictions on exports because of the increasing competition for natural resources in the world economy. And this is likely to continue. The United States' view on a bipartisan basis in recent years and dating back decades has been that the export restrictions are not a good idea and should be opposed. And indeed, the United States has taken the position against China in 2 current cases in WTO dispute settlement that export restrictions imposed by the Chinese are in violation of WTO rules. The United States won the case in raw materials. The United States continues to pursue the case in rare earths. These are arguments the United States is making and arguments on which the United States has thus far prevailed in WTO dispute settlement. And yet at the same time, we are imposing restrictions on our own exports. Now, I would be the first to say that the WTO Treaty does not require that any WTO member be consistent in its trade policy. I would also suggest that there is no single member of the WTO who is consistent in its trade policy. But as the largest trading nation in the world, and therefore the one with the largest stake in the effectiveness of world trade rules, the United States of America perhaps has the largest interest in making certain that, to the extent we can be, we are consistent. There's also a bit of context that I would add here, and that is it somehow is necessary to point out that energy products are covered by the WTO Treaty. I talk to people in the energy industry, and they seem to go beyond the notion of an afterthought. They seem to have tacitly internalized the assumption that for some reason WTO rules don't apply to them. I've thought about this, and I think it's because of a point I made a moment ago, which is that over the course of the past half century, our disputes have been about import restrictions, and few people have wanted to restrict imports of oil or natural gas. They want them when they want them, and they don't want to restrict them. And it's only now that we're focusing on export restrictions that it's dawning on anyone that these rules might apply to oil or natural gas or coal or other energy products. Indeed, they do. Indeed, they do. These products are traded products to which WTO rules apply. Here, I will be suggestive as opposed to definitive, but one of the agreements in the WTO Treaty that is at issue here is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Article 11 of the GATT. I had the misfortune while I was in the Congress of actually having read the GATT. Article 11 of the GATT imposes a prohibition on quantitative restrictions of exports. There's an exception in the language due to a compromise at the Havana Conference in 1947 that says you can have export taxes. But we don't do export taxes in the United States, so that's not an issue for us. We are bound by this general prohibition on quantitative restrictions on exports. There are some exceptions, but those exceptions don't necessarily excuse what's going on. For example, you can have temporary restrictions where there are critical shortages. There are no critical shortages here in terms of oil and natural gas, and the restrictions we have on crude oil exports in our law are not temporary. By terms of the law, they are permanent. So that exception doesn't apply. There are also some defenses that are potentially available under Article 20 of the GATT relating to measures that are imposed because they're necessary to health or because they relate to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources. Potentially these kinds of defenses could be available, but only if these measures are of a certain kind and if they are applied in a certain way. Just to mention a couple of examples, if you're going to have a benefit of an environmental defense, you have to have an environmental measure. And all of the discussion that we've heard about whether we should or should not lift restrictions on exports of these energy products has been about the effect on the competitiveness of U.S. industry. It hasn't been about the environment. And then even if these measures are of a certain nature, they have to be applied in a way that does not result in arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination between countries where the same conditions prevail, or an undisguised or a disguised restriction on international trade. Here I'm quoting the chapeau, as they say in Geneva, of Article 20. And query, as we would say in the law classes, whether we would pass that particular test for that defense. There are also certain other questions that arise in my mind, given the prism through which I see these particular measures that are rarely discussed, if at all, in the public debate. We've heard today about the exceptions in the natural gas licensing rules for countries with whom we have free trade agreements. Well, are these particular exceptions legal under the WTO? I don't know. I haven't delved into the depths of these, but any free trade agreement with one member of the WTO is, by definition, a decision to discriminate in trade against another or many more members of the WTO. How is that legal given the WTO's general rule of non-discrimination? It's legal only if you have a free trade agreement. What is a free trade agreement? Under Article 24, a free trade agreement applies to substantially all the trade among the parties to that agreement. What is substantially all of the trade? One of my great accomplishments in nearly a decade as a jurist in Geneva is able to get out of Geneva alive without having to answer that question. But some country that's not privy or a party to one of these special arrangements may raise their hand in the WTO and ask that question, and under WTO rules, it will then have to be answered. One other issue I'll mention is the issue of subsidies, on which Scott touched. This is a fascinating topic. In addition to the GATT, another of the WTO agreements that is part of the WTO Treaty is the WTO Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures. It's there more than any other reason because the United States worked decades to make certain it was there, to define a subsidy and make certain that subsidies were disciplined so as not to distort free trade in products worldwide. And we have been diligent in trying to insist on the fair and thorough implementation of the subsidies agreement. The question is that by restricting exports so as to reduce domestic prices of oil or natural gas, is the United States granting a subsidy to the manufacturing firms that are the downstream domestic users of natural gas? As has already been mentioned, it has been the U.S. position in a number of cases that this type of arrangement is a subsidy. And it is one that needs either to be withdrawn or it is one that can be countered through countervailing duties. It is possible that someone could bring a case against the United States making these same arguments that we have made against others and prevail against us and have the effect of raising the prices of our exports. I would make only one general observation before stepping down. I'll try to answer your questions to the extent that you have them in whatever time we have left. But the general observation I would like to make would be about what I see as the illusion of self-sufficiency. This is not a new notion. Scott mentioned the notion of autarky. We have that work because the Greeks invented it, and they invented it because of the notion of self-sufficiency that they have. But I would hope we had grown beyond that. If not, we need to go back and read Adam Smith and David Ricardo and a few others. The notion that we can be self-sufficient is an illusion. No one country is ever going to be self-sufficient in everything. There's always going to be something that we will want from someone else. Furthermore, any one of us as an individual should be comparable to a country in that, do we really want to be self-sufficient in all that we do? Do I want to make my own watch? Do I want to draw my own water? Do I want to make my own pen? Division of labor is at the heart of our complex society and our complex world. International trade is international only because it crosses lines that are artificial. Those lines exist only because we believe that they do. An economist would tell us, indeed Adam Smith told us, that the division of labor is limited only by the extent of the marketplace. Increasingly, the marketplace is worldwide. And what we should be seeking, in my view, is economic and energy security and not independence, because the notion of independence in energy especially is an illusion. And imposing restrictions on exports as a matter of policy is, in my view, short-sighted and self-defeating economic nationalism. It is also, in many respects, illegal under international law. Thank you very much.
Yeah, right here. Ken.
Hey, Ken Monahan with Bloomberg Government. And a question for Congressman Bacchus and also Scott on the likelihood that a WTO case could be filed against the U.S. And second, maybe which country might actually file that case. Europe is one maybe candidate, but they're negotiating with the U.S. on TTIP. Maybe there's some of a hesitance on the EU's part to raise such a high-profile case. Just wondering what other country might actually take that step and who would be willing to go there, so to speak. China clearly would be at risk given its export restrictions and the cases against them on raw materials. Just wondering who that might be and how likely it would be that you could see that happening. Thanks.
Well, keep in mind what I said about no country being bound by consistency. It's possible that the Chinese, having lost these cases relating to their own export restrictions, might choose to use those rulings as precedents to bring a case of their own. I don't advise the Chinese, and I'm not advocating this, but that's conceivable. I don't know which particular country might take this initiative. Certainly it would be one that feels left out of current arrangements, so it wouldn't be one that's privy to a free trade agreement with us. It wouldn't be one that looks to be in one of these arrangements currently being negotiated, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But in my view, this question of the meaning of Article 24 of the GATT will eventually be asked and answered in WTO dispute settlement. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is a good example. What is it? Is it a free trade agreement? If so, what makes it a free trade agreement? If it's not a free trade agreement, then on what basis is it legal for these a dozen members of the WTO to agree on a pattern of discrimination against other members of the WTO? 3 times on 3 continents in the past 6 weeks, I have had people in the audience representing countries not involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership stand and ask what they could do to keep from being discriminated against in this arrangement. I think that if and when a WTO case were brought on the oil or natural gas issue, it would come from a similar aggrieved party. And one last point, to which I alluded in passing on the podium. If any member of the WTO chooses to bring a case in WTO dispute settlement, they cannot be stopped. Under the dispute settlement understanding, they have only to decide on their own whether it is, quote, unquote, fruitful for them to bring that case. That's it. There's no executive committee that says we'd rather this case not be brought. And then under the rules, if the case goes through the panel and gets all the way to my successors on the appellate body, and if the legal issue is raised directly on appeal, under the WTO rules, the appellate body shall address that issue. It must rule. I remember when I was on the appellate body, some of my former colleagues in the Congress would give speeches that would say, why doesn't the appellate body simply refuse to rule on this case? Why don't they use their discretion like the Supreme Court does, not to rule? And the answer is they don't have that discretion. It doesn't exist for the appellate body. So once the trigger is pulled in dispute settlement, if the country bringing the complaint wants to pursue it to the end, they will get an answer. And the world may not like the answer that we get.